He died defending her honor. 20 years later, she returned with his badge. The dusty main street of Redemption Creek was quieter than a graveyard at midnight. But Margaret Thornton wasn't looking for quiet. She was looking for justice. And after 2 decades of waiting, she finally had the power to deliver it. The silver badge on her chest caught the harsh afternoon sun as she stepped down from the stagecoach. Deputy U.S. Marshal, the same rank her beloved James had held when they gunned him down in cold blood. The irony wasn't lost on her. The very badge he died wearing was now hers to carry. Nobody in this God-forsaken town recognized her. 20 years had a way of changing a person. The innocent school teacher with soft hands and hopeful eyes was gone. In her place stood a woman forged by loss, shaped by determination, and hardened by the long road to this moment. Her boots clicked against the weathered boardwalk as she made her way toward the Silver Dollar Saloon. The same saloon where it all happened. The same saloon where her world had shattered like glass hitting stone. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began, 20 years earlier. Margaret was just 24 years old, fresh from the East, with a teaching certificate and dreams of bringing education to the frontier. Redemption Creek was rough around the edges, but it was growing. Families were settling down, children needed schooling, and Margaret believed she could make a difference. James Crawford was the deputy marshal who'd been assigned to protect her during those first uncertain weeks. He was 32, weathered by years of keeping the peace in a lawless land, but his eyes still held kindness when he smiled at her that first day, removing his hat and introducing himself with genuine respect. Margaret felt something she'd never experienced before. "Ma'am, I'm James Crawford. Marshals asked me to make sure you get settled, safe and sound." His voice was like warm honey over rough stone, gentle but strong enough to handle whatever trouble might come calling. Those first few months were like a beautiful dream. James would walk her to the schoolhouse every morning, ensuring she was safe from the drunks and troublemakers who might not respect a proper lady. In the evenings, he'd escort her home, sometimes stopping by her small cabin to check on her well-being. It started with small gestures. He'd bring her coffee on cold mornings. She'd save him an extra biscuit from her lunch. He'd fix her broken fence without being asked. She'd mend the tears in his shirt when he'd been in a scuffle. The folks in town began to notice. Margaret Sinclair, the pretty school teacher, and James Crawford, the respectful lawman, were falling in love right before their eyes. It was the kind of pure, honest courtship that made even the hardest men smile and tip their hats. But not everyone was pleased with this budding romance. Victor Carbone owned half the businesses in Redemption Creek, including the Silver Dollar Saloon, the general store, and most of the land on the outskirts of town. He was a man who took what he wanted when he wanted it, and from the moment Margaret stepped off that first stagecoach, he wanted her. Carbone was in his 50s, with graying hair and cold blue eyes that never seemed to blink. He dressed like a gentleman, but everyone knew what kind of man he really was. The kind who bought silence with silver and settled disputes with lead. He'd made his intentions clear to Margaret from the beginning. Flowers sent to her cabin, invitations to dinner at the finest restaurant in town, even an offer to build her a bigger schoolhouse if she'd just give him a chance. Margaret politely declined every advance. She was a lady, after all. and she knew how to handle unwanted attention with grace and firmness. But Victor Carbone wasn't used to being told no. The trouble started on a crisp October evening. Margaret had stayed late at the schoolhouse, preparing lessons for the next day. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that took her breath away. She was just gathering her things when she heard the saloon doors swing open across the street. Victor Carbone stepped out, his expensive boots echoing on the wooden sidewalk. His eyes found her window immediately, as if he'd been watching and waiting. He crossed the street with the confidence of a man who owned everything he could see. Margaret's heart began to race, but not with excitement, with fear. "Miss Sinclair," he called through the door. "Might I have a word?" Margaret's hands trembled as she continued packing her books. "It's rather late, Mr. Carbone. Perhaps we could speak tomorrow." "I'm afraid this can't wait." His voice carried an edge she'd never heard before. "Open the door, Margaret. We need to talk," the way he said. Her first name made her skin crawl. She'd never given him permission to use it. "I'm sorry, but I really must be getting home." "Good evening, Mr. Carbone." She heard his fist slam against the door, making her jump backward. The gentle pretense was falling away, revealing the monster underneath. "You've been avoiding me for months," he growled, "making me look like a fool in front of the whole town." "I've been patient, Margaret, more patient than any man should have to be." Margaret's heart was pounding now. She looked toward the window, hoping to see James making his evening rounds. But the street was empty, except for Victor Carbone's shadow falling across her doorway. "I've tried to court you proper-like," he continued, his voice growing more aggressive. "Sent you flowers, invited you to dinner, offered you the finest things money can buy. But you throw it all back in my face. For what? A tin star and a deputy's wages." Margaret pressed herself against the far wall, clutching her books like a shield. "Mr. Carbone, please leave. I've done nothing to encourage your attentions, and I've asked you to respect my wishes." "Your wishes?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Your wishes don't matter anymore, sweetheart. You've embarrassed me long enough. Time you learned what happens to women who don't know their place." The door handle turned. Margaret had forgotten to lock it. Victor Carbone stepped into the schoolhouse like he owned it, like he owned her. The setting sun behind him cast his shadow, long and dark, across the wooden floor. "Please," Margaret whispered, backing toward the corner. "Please, don't do this." "Don't do what?" He smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing she'd ever seen. "I'm just here to talk, to help you understand your situation." He moved closer, and Margaret could smell the whiskey on his breath, the expensive cologne that couldn't mask the rot underneath. Her back hit the wall, and she realized she had nowhere left to run. "You see, Margaret," he said, reaching out to touch her face, "this town belongs to me. The marshal belongs to me. Even that boyfriend of yours belongs to me, whether he knows it or not. And now, you're going to belong to me, too." Margaret jerked her head away from his touch. "James will never let you hurt me." Victor's laugh was like breaking glass. "James Crawford is one man with one gun. I own 20 men with 20 guns. What do you think is going to happen when it comes down to it?" That's when they heard the footsteps on the boardwalk outside. "Margaret," James's voice called through the open door. "You still here?" Saw the light burning and wanted to make sure Everything was all right. Victor's eyes glittered with malicious pleasure. Well, well, looks like we're about to find out just how far your hero is willing to go. James appeared in the doorway, and Margaret had never been so relieved to see anyone in her entire life. He took in the scene immediately. Margaret pressed against the wall, tears in her eyes, and Victor Carbone standing too close to her, with his hand still raised toward her face. "Step away from her, Carbone." James's voice was deadly quiet. His hand moved instinctively to the gun at his hip. "Or what, deputy?" Victor turned slowly, his smile never wavering. "You'll shoot an unarmed man in front of a lady. That's not very civilized," I said. "Step away from her." Victor raised his hands in mock surrender. "Easy there, Crawford. Margaret and I were just having a friendly conversation, weren't we, darling?" Margaret found her voice. "He forced his way in here, James. He threatened me. Something dangerous flickered in James's eyes. That true Carbone. Now, that's a matter of perspective, isn't it?" Victor's voice remained casual, but Margaret could see the calculation behind his eyes. "I came to discuss a business proposition with Miss Sinclair. If she misunderstood my intentions, well, that's unfortunate. Get out." James stepped aside, clearing the doorway. Now, Victor straightened his jacket and walked toward the door with infuriating calm. As he passed James, he paused and spoke just loud enough for Margaret to hear. "This isn't over, Crawford. Not by a long shot." After Victor left, James rushed to Margaret's side. His hands were gentle as he checked to make sure she wasn't hurt, his eyes full of concern and barely contained rage. "Did he touch you?" he asked quietly. "No," Margaret whispered, though she was still shaking. "But James, the things he said. He owns the marshal. He owns 20 gunmen. What are we going to do?" James took her hands in his, and Margaret could feel the calluses from years of hard work and gunfights. "We're going to do what's right. That's what we always do." But Margaret could see the worry in his eyes, even as he tried to comfort her. They both knew Victor Carbone wasn't the type of man to accept defeat gracefully. The next few weeks passed in tense quiet. Victor kept his distance, but Margaret could feel his eyes on her whenever she walked through town. James increased his vigilance, never leaving her alone for long, always making sure she was safe. The other townspeople began to notice the tension. Some whispered that Margaret should just accept Victor's proposal and save everyone the trouble. Others muttered that James was stirring up unnecessary conflict with the town's most powerful man, Marshal Tom Bradley, a man in his 60s who'd seen too many fights and buried too many friends, called James into his office on a gray November morning. "Son," he said, not looking up from the paperwork on his desk, "we need to talk." James stood at attention, his hat in his hands. "Yes, sir. Victor Carbone came to see me yesterday. He's concerned about your attachment to Miss Sinclair." James's jaw tightened. "My personal life isn't his concern, Marshal. It is when it affects the peace of this town." Marshal Bradley finally looked up, and James could see the weariness in his eyes. "Carbone's made it clear that he considers Miss Sinclair to be under his protection. He wants you to back off." "Protection?" James's voice rose, despite his efforts to stay calm. "Marshal, he cornered her in the schoolhouse. He threatened her. That's not protection. That's his word against hers." The marshal held up a hand. And Victor Carbone owns half this town, James. His word carries weight. James stared at his superior officer, understanding dawning on his face. You're telling me to abandon her. I'm telling you to be smart. Find yourself a nice girl from one of the ranching families. Someone who won't cause complications. James placed his badge on the desk with a metallic clink. Then I guess you'll need to find yourself a new deputy. Don't be a fool, boy. The marshal stood up quickly. You walk away from this job. You've got nothing. No income, no authority, no protection. Carbone will crush you like a bug. James picked up his hat and placed it firmly on his head. Maybe so, but I'll die with my honor intact. He walked out of the marshal's office and straight to the schoolhouse, where Margaret was teaching a roomful of children their afternoon lessons. Through the window, he watched her gentle smile as she helped a young boy with his arithmetic. The sight filled him with such love and determination that he knew he'd made the right choice. When school ended, James was waiting outside. Margaret emerged with her usual armload of books and papers, but her smile faltered when she saw his expression. What's wrong? She asked immediately. James took her books and offered her his arm. Let's walk. We need to talk. As they strolled down the dusty road toward her cabin, James told her everything about Victor's visit to the marshal, about the ultimatum, about his decision to resign rather than abandon her. Margaret stopped walking. James, no, you can't give up your career. For me, it's already done. But what will we do? How will we live? James turned to face her, taking her hands in his. The setting sun painted everything in golden light, and Margaret thought her heart might burst from the love she saw in his eyes. Marry me, Margaret. The words hung in the air between them like a prayer. Margaret felt tears welling up, but they were tears of joy mixed with fear. James, I want nothing more in this world. But Victor Carbone won't just let us ride into the sunset. You know that. Then we'll face whatever comes together. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a simple gold ring. I know it's not much, but it's perfect, Margaret breathed, her heart soaring despite her fears. James slipped the ring onto her finger as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. In that moment, with the first stars beginning to twinkle overhead, they were the happiest people in the entire territory. But happiness in the Wild West was often a fleeting thing. Word of their engagement spread through Redemption Creek like wildfire. By morning, everyone knew that the schoolteacher and the former deputy were planning to marry. Most folks offered their congratulations. Some shook their heads in worry. A few crossed themselves and whispered prayers. Victor Carbone said nothing at all. And that silence was more terrifying than any threat he could have made. James found work at the livery stable, caring for horses and fixing wagons. It wasn't the same as wearing a badge, but it was honest work that would support a family. Margaret continued teaching, saving every penny for their future together. They planned a simple wedding for Christmas Eve. Nothing fancy, just a ceremony at the small church with whoever wanted to attend. Margaret would wear her mother's dress, altered to fit. James would wear his best suit, the one he'd bought for special occasions back when he thought he'd be a lawman forever. 3 days before the wedding, James was working late at the livery stable, shoeing a horse by lamplight. The December wind howled through the gaps in the walls, making the flames dance and throwing moving shadows across the hay-covered floor. He didn't hear them coming until it was too late. 5 men stepped out of the darkness, their faces hidden by bandanas, their hands resting on their gun belts. James recognized their posture, their stance. These weren't common thieves or drifters. These were professional killers. "Evening Crawford," the tallest one said. His voice was muffled by the cloth over his face, but James could hear the smile underneath. "Working hard, I see." James's hand moved slowly toward his gun. "What do you want?" "Just delivering a message." The man's tone was conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "From a mutual friend, let me guess. Victor Carbone. Smart man. Too smart for your own good, some might say." The horse James had been shoeing whinnied nervously, sensing the tension in the air. James kept his voice steady, but his muscles were coiled like a spring. "What's the message?" "Simple. Leave town tonight. Take nothing with you. Don't say goodbye to anyone. Don't ever come back." James almost laughed. "And if I refuse, then we'll deliver a different kind of message to someone you care about." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a campfire. James felt cold rage building in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. "You touch her, and I'll hunt down every last one of you." Big words from a man with no badge. The leader stepped closer. "You've got until dawn, Crawford. After that, we stop being polite." They melted back into the darkness as quickly as they'd appeared, leaving James alone with his racing heart and terrible choices. He could run, take Margaret, and flee in the night, start over somewhere else. But he knew Victor Carbone's reach was long. They'd never truly be safe, or he could stay and fight, 1 man against 20, with no legal authority and no backup. It would be suicide, unless... James looked at the badge he'd placed on his workbench, the one he'd planned to return to Marshall Bradley in the morning. The silver star caught the lamplight, and suddenly he knew what he had to do. He couldn't run, he couldn't hide, but he could make a stand that would mean something, a stand that would protect Margaret even if it cost him everything. The next morning, Margaret knew something was wrong the moment she saw James's face. He was waiting outside the schoolhouse, but his usual smile was nowhere to be found. "We need to talk," he said quietly. They walked to their favorite spot by the creek, where they'd shared their first kiss just a few months before. The water babbled peacefully over the rocks, and birds sang in the cottonwood trees. It should have been a perfect morning. James told her about the visit from Carbone's men, about the ultimatum, about the impossible choice he was facing. "Then we'll leave," Margaret said immediately. "Tonight. We'll go to California, or Oregon, or anywhere he can't find us." James shook his head. "He'll find us, Margaret. Men like Carbone don't give up, and I won't spend my life looking over my shoulder, wondering when they'll catch up to us." "Then what are you saying?" James took her hands, memorizing the feel of her fingers intertwined with his. "I'm saying I love you more than my own life, and sometimes love means making the hardest choice of all." Margaret's blood turned to ice. "James, no. Whatever you're thinking, no. If I face them tonight, if I make a stand, maybe they'll leave. You alone. Maybe you can have the life you deserve. Not without you." Margaret's voice cracked with desperation. "I don't want a life without you." James pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling her heart beating against his chest. "Remember me, Margaret. Remember that someone loved you enough to fight for you." That evening, the Silver Dollar Saloon was busier than usual. Word had spread that something big was going to happen, though nobody was quite sure what. Cowboys and merchants, gamblers and drifters, all packed into the smoky room, nursing their drinks and waiting for the show to begin. Victor Carbone sat at his usual table in the back corner, a bottle of expensive whiskey and 5 empty glasses arranged before him. His men were scattered throughout the room, trying to look casual but fooling nobody. At exactly 9 o'clock, the saloon doors swung open. James Crawford stepped inside, and the entire room fell silent. He was wearing his best suit, the one he'd planned to marry Margaret in. On his chest, pinned right over his heart, was his deputy marshal's badge. He walked through the crowd like Moses, parting the Red Sea. Cowboys stepped aside, gamblers looked away, and even the bartender stopped polishing glasses to stare. James stopped directly in front of Victor Carbone's table. "You wanted to talk," he said quietly. "Let's talk." Victor leaned back in his chair, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "James Crawford, I have to admit, I didn't think you'd show up. Here I am." "Yes, you are." Victor poured whiskey into one of the empty glasses and pushed it across the table. "Drink with me, Crawford. Let's discuss this like civilized men." James didn't touch the glass. "Nothing to discuss. You threatened the woman I love. That makes this personal. Personal." Victor's smile widened. "How refreshingly honest. I appreciate a man who speaks his mind." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every man present knew they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. "So what's it going to be, Crawford?" Victor asked, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "Are you here to arrest me? Because last I checked, you don't have a badge anymore." James opened his coat, revealing the silver star pinned to his vest. "I've got a badge. That's not your badge anymore." Victor's voice hardened. "You resigned, remember. A man can change his mind. Not when the marshal already agreed to stay out of my business." The room seemed to hold its breath. Everyone understood what was happening now. This wasn't just a personal dispute. This was a showdown between law and lawlessness, between justice and corruption. James's voice carried to every corner of the saloon. "Victor Carbone, you're under arrest for threatening a citizen of this territory and for attempting assault." Victor threw back his head and laughed. "On whose authority? Mine. You have no authority here, boy." James's hand moved to rest on his gun. "I have the authority that comes from being willing to die for what's right." The laughter died on Victor's lips. Around the room, his men tensed, hands moving toward their weapons. "You really want to do this?" Victor asked quietly. "You really want to die for a school teacher who forgets your name within a year? She's worth dying for. But more than that, she's worth living for. And I can't live knowing you're free to hurt her." Victor stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. 5 against 1, Crawford. Those aren't good odds. Good enough. The silence stretched like a bowstring. Margaret, meanwhile, was pacing her cabin like a caged animal, knowing in her heart that something terrible was about to happen. She'd tried to talk James out of this madness, but she knew him too well. He was a man of principle, a man who couldn't walk away when justice was at stake. It was one of the reasons she loved him. It might also be the reason she lost him. Unable to bear the waiting any longer, Margaret threw her shawl around her shoulders and stepped out into the cold December night. The Silver Dollar Saloon glowed like a beacon in the darkness, and she could hear the murmur of voices carrying on the wind. She was halfway there when the shooting started. The first gunshot shattered the silence like thunder. Then came the others, a rapid succession of explosions that echoed off the buildings and sent dogs howling throughout the town. Margaret ran toward the sound, her heart in her throat, her worst fears driving her forward. Behind her, doors began opening as the townspeople emerged to see what had happened. She burst through the saloon doors to find chaos. Tables overturned, glass scattered across the floor, and the acrid smell of gunpowder filling the air. James was on the floor near the bar, blood spreading across his white shirt. Victor Carbone lay motionless by his overturned table. 2 of Carbone's men were down, and the other 3 were clutching wounds, their faces pale with shock. Margaret fell to her knees beside James, her hands fluttering over his chest, trying to stop the bleeding that seemed to be everywhere. "James," she whispered, "James, look at me." His eyes opened, and for a moment they were as clear and blue as a summer sky. "Margaret, I'm here, I'm right here. Did I get him?" Margaret looked toward Victor Carbone's still form. Yes, you got him." James smiled, and blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. "Good. He won't hurt you anymore. Don't talk. Save your strength. The doctor's coming." But they both knew the doctor wouldn't arrive in time. James had taken 3 bullets, 1 in the shoulder, 1 in the chest, and 1 that had torn through his side. He was losing blood too fast. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice growing weaker, "I need you to promise me something. Anything. Don't let them say I died for nothing. Don't let them forget that someone stood up to Victor Carbone." Tears streamed down Margaret's face. "I promise. And Margaret, live. Don't spend your life mourning me. Find happiness. I can't, not without you." James reached up with trembling fingers and touched her face. "You're stronger than you know, stronger than all of them." His hand fell away, and the light faded from his eyes. Margaret held him as his breathing grew shallow, then stopped altogether. The man who'd loved her enough to die for her was gone. The official report said that Deputy Marshal James Crawford had been killed while attempting to arrest Victor Carbone on charges of assault and threatening behavior. It said that Carbone had resisted arrest and that several men had died in the ensuing gunfight. It didn't mention that James had resigned his badge the day before. It didn't mention that he'd pinned it back on just to make one last stand for justice. It didn't mention that he'd faced 5 armed men alone because it was the right thing to do. Marshal Bradley, perhaps feeling guilty about his role in the tragedy, saw to it that James was buried with full honors. The entire town turned out for the funeral, and Margaret walked behind the coffin in her black dress, carrying herself with a dignity that made even Victor Carbone's surviving men look away in shame. After the funeral, Margaret did something that surprised everyone. She didn't leave town. She didn't break down. She didn't retreat into her grief and disappear. Instead, she went back to teaching. She continued living in her small cabin. She wore her engagement ring every day. And when people asked her why, she told them she was still engaged to the memory of a good man. But Margaret was planning. Day by day, week by week, month by month, she was preparing for something that would take her years to accomplish. She began studying law books, borrowing them from traveling lawyers, and ordering them from back east. She read everything she could about territorial law, federal law, and the rights of citizens in frontier towns. She also began writing letters to territorial officials, federal marshals, anyone who might listen to her story about corruption in Redemption Creek. Most never wrote back, but some did. One letter, written to the U.S. Marshal's office in Denver, caught the attention of a federal investigator named William Hayes. He was building a case against corruption in several frontier towns, and Margaret's detailed account of Victor Carbone's operations provided exactly the kind of evidence he needed. Margaret became Hayes's secret correspondent, documenting everything she observed about the illegal activities that continued in Redemption Creek even after Carbone's death. His son, Victor Jr., had taken over the family business and was proving to be just as ruthless as his father. The investigation took years. During that time, Margaret never stopped teaching, never stopped planning, and never stopped wearing James's ring. The people of Redemption Creek began to see her differently, not as the fragile Eastern schoolteacher who'd needed protection, but as a woman of steel wrapped in silk. When Marshal Bradley retired, his replacement was hand-picked by the Carbone family. When the town sheriff died in a suspicious riding accident, his replacement was also in the Carbone's pocket. Margaret documented it all, building a case that would eventually bring down an entire network of corruption. But she wanted more than just to see criminals punished. She wanted to honor James's sacrifice in a way that would have made him proud. At 35, Margaret applied to become a deputy U.S. Marshal. It was almost unheard of for a woman to hold such a position, but Margaret had advantages that most applicants didn't. She had a spotless reputation, extensive knowledge of territorial law, and the strong recommendation of Federal Marshal William Hayes, who'd been so impressed by her investigative work that he'd personally vouched for her character and capabilities. More importantly, she had something that couldn't be taught or trained, an unshakable moral compass and the courage to follow it wherever it led. The training was brutal. Margaret spent months learning to shoot with deadly accuracy, to track criminals across hostile terrain, to fight with her fists when guns weren't enough. She learned to read men's faces for signs of deception, to spot trouble before it started, and to command respect in a world that didn't want to give it to her. When she finally earned her badge, Margaret felt James's presence as clearly as if he were standing beside her. She'd done it. She'd become the law in a land where law was often just a suggestion. And now, 20 years after James Crawford had died defending her honor, Margaret was coming home. As she walked down the main street of Redemption Creek, Margaret noticed how little had changed. The same weathered buildings, the same dusty roads, the same silver dollar saloon where her love had made his final stand. But the people had changed. Victor Carbone Jr. was now in his 40s, graying at the temples like his father had been. He stood on the saloon's porch, watching the strange woman with the federal badge walk through his town. He didn't recognize her. None of them did. Margaret pushed through the saloon doors, and conversation died just as it had 20 years before. But this time, she was the one wearing the badge. This time, she was the one with the authority. "Victor Carbone Jr.," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the smoky room. "You're under arrest." Victor looked up from his poker game, his face showing more annoyance than concern. "On what charges, Marshal Thornton?" Deputy U.S. Marshal Margaret Thornton. She let the name sink in for a moment before continuing. You're under arrest for operating an illegal gambling enterprise, for bribing federal officials, for intimidating witnesses, and for conspiracy to commit murder. Victor's face paled slightly, but his voice remained steady. I think you have me confused with someone else, Marshal. I run a legitimate business here, do you? Margaret reached into her coat and pulled out a thick folder. Because I have documentation going back 15 years that says otherwise. Bank records, witness statements, correspondence with known criminals. Would you like me to read some of it aloud? The poker game forgotten. Victor stood up slowly. Around the room, his men were starting to move, hands drifting toward their weapons. I don't know who you think you are, lady, but you're making a big mistake. Margaret smiled, and it was like winter sunshine, beautiful but cold as ice. I know exactly who I am. I'm the woman whose fiancé you had murdered 20 years ago. I'm the woman who spent 2 decades building a case against you and your family. And I'm the woman who's going to see justice done at last. Recognition dawned on Victor's face like a terrible sunrise. Margaret Sinclair. Well, I'll be damned. Very likely, Margaret agreed. Now, are you going to come quietly, or do we need to do this the hard way? Victor's hand moved toward his gun, and Margaret could see the calculation in his eyes. He was probably thinking the same thing his father had thought 20 years ago, that one lawman couldn't stand against his entire organization. But Margaret wasn't alone. The saloon doors opened behind her, and 6 federal marshals stepped inside, their badges gleaming, their hands resting on their weapons. Margaret had brought back up this time. The hard way it is, Victor muttered. What happened? Next was over in seconds. But those seconds contained 20 years of justice finally being served. Victor went for his gun. Margaret was faster. Her shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon flying. Around the room, his men tried to draw their weapons, but they were facing 7 federal marshals who'd been preparing for this moment for months. When the gun smoke cleared, Victor Carbone Jr. was on the floor, bleeding but alive. 3 of his men were dead, and the rest were surrendering with their hands in the air. Margaret walked over to where Victor lay, clutching his wounded shoulder. She knelt down beside him, close enough that only he could hear her words. Your father thought he could scare James into running. He thought threatening me would be enough to break a good man's spirit. He was wrong. Victor glared up at her, his face twisted with pain and rage. You think this changes anything? You think killing my father made you some kind of hero? I didn't kill your father, Margaret said quietly. James did. While he was dying, shot full of holes by your father's cowards. James Crawford still managed to put a bullet right where it counted. Your father died knowing he'd been beaten by a better man. That's not ... the report said. The report said what people needed to hear. But I was there, Victor. I saw it all. Your father's last words were begging for mercy from a man he'd tried to have murdered. Margaret stood up, looking down at the man who'd inherited his father's empire of corruption. And now, 20 years later, that same man's justice is coming for you. As her fellow marshals hauled Victor and his surviving men away in chains, Margaret walked to the spot where James had fallen. The bloodstains were long gone, scrubbed away by 20 years of foot traffic and spilled drinks. But she could still see him there, still feel his presence. She unpinned her badge and held it in her palm, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a frightened schoolteacher to a federal marshal, from a victim to an agent of justice. "It's done, James," she whispered. "It's finally done." Outside, the sun was setting behind the mountains, just as it had on that last perfect evening they'd shared together. But this time, the sunset felt like a beginning instead of an ending. The trials that followed made headlines across the territory. Victor Carbone Jr. and his organization were exposed for what they really were: a criminal enterprise that had corrupted law enforcement and terrorized honest citizens for decades. Margaret's testimony was devastating and detailed. She had names, dates, bank records, and witness statements. She'd built a case so thorough that even the best lawyer's money could buy couldn't poke holes in it.